Let's talk about something that most people get completely wrong when it comes to building influence and power in their lives. If you ask the average person how someone becomes powerful, how they become the kind of person that other people respect, listen to, and take seriously, most of them are going to give you some version of the same answer. They'll say you need to be more confident, you need to put yourself out there more, you need to network, build connections, make yourself visible, you need to add things to your life. And look, none of that is entirely wrong. Those things can help. But here's the thing. That's only half the picture, and most people never get to the other half. Because when you actually study how influence works in real life, not in motivational videos, not in self-help books, but in actual day-to-day situations with real people, you start to notice something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The people who carry real weight in a room, the ones who don't have to fight for respect, who don't have to constantly prove themselves, who seem to move through situations without a lot of friction, they're not always adding things to their lives. A lot of the time, they're removing things, quietly, without making a big deal out of it, without announcing it to anyone. They're identifying the habits, the behaviors, the tendencies that are working against them, and they're cutting them out, one by one, gradually, without drama. And what's left after all that removal is something that a lot of people never quite manage to build, a kind of steady, durable influence that doesn't depend on how loud you are or how much attention you're getting on any given day. Now here's what's interesting about this. Most people never build that kind of influence, not because they aren't smart enough or talented enough or capable enough. They absolutely are. The real reason most people never get there is simpler than that. They're holding on to stuff that keeps working against them, and they don't even realize it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. 10 specific things that are worth quietly cutting out if you want to build the kind of power and influence that actually holds up over time. No big announcements, no dramatic life overhaul, just honest, grounded, practical adjustments, the kind that don't make noise but absolutely change how you move through the world and how people experience you when you're in the room. Let's get into it. Number 1, needing people to like you. All right, let's start with the first one, and this one's going to hit close to home for a lot of people, even if they don't want to admit it. The need to be liked. Now, wanting people to like you isn't some weird character flaw. It's pretty human. Most of us grow up in environments where approval matters, from parents, teachers, friends, coworkers. We're wired to care about what people think of us to some degree. That's just reality. But here's where it becomes a problem. When that need for approval starts shaping your decisions, when it starts determining what you say, what you won't say, what positions you take, what positions you back away from, that's when it starts costing you something real. Think about how this actually plays out in everyday life. Someone is in a meeting and they have a genuine concern about the direction of a project, but they look around the room, they sense that their opinion might be unpopular, and they stay quiet. They soften their concern. They go along with the group, not because they actually agree, but because the discomfort of potentially losing that person's approval feels worse than just going along with it. This is how the need to be liked operates. It's usually not dramatic. It's usually small, quiet, everyday adjustments, and most people don't even recognize it's happening in the moment. But here's what it does over time. When people around you figure out, and they will figure out, that you're the kind of person who adjusts based on social pressure, your influence drops. Because now they know you're predictable. They know that if they push back, you'll soften. They know that something gets uncomfortable, you'll find a way to smooth it over at your own expense. And once that pattern is established, people don't take your positions as seriously, because they know those positions are negotiable. Real influence starts when you genuinely become okay with not being liked by everyone. Not comfortable being difficult, that's not the goal. Not looking for conflict, that's not it either. The shift is simpler than that. It's just being willing to make the right call even when it costs you something socially. Being willing to hold a position even when the room disagrees with you.
being willing to say no and let that be the answer, without chasing the other person's approval afterward. Because here's what actually happens when you start doing that. People notice. They start to see you as someone who actually means what they say. And that kind of consistency, that's where real respect comes from. And respect, as it turns out, holds up a lot longer than approval ever does.
Over-explaining yourself. Here's one that's a little more subtle, but just as important. And once you start noticing it, you'll see it everywhere. Pay attention to how often you explain yourself. Not how often you communicate, how often you explain. Because there's a real difference between those two things. Communicating is just sharing information. You say what needs to be said. It's direct, it's clear, it gets the job done. Explaining is something different. Explaining usually means you're looking for something, understanding, acceptance, validation. You want the other person to get why you did what you did. You want them to see your reasoning. You want to make sure they don't think less of you. So what does that look like in practice? It looks like someone making a decision, totally reasonable decision, and then immediately launching into a paragraph about all the reasons behind it. It looks like someone setting a boundary and then spending 5 minutes walking through their entire thought process to justify it. It looks like someone saying no to something and then apologizing 3 times and explaining their whole schedule to soften the blow. And again, this comes from a decent place. Most people over-explain because they don't want to come across as dismissive or uncaring. They want to make sure the other person feels considered. That's not a bad instinct. But here's what actually happens when you over-explain. The moment you start justifying yourself at length, you've opened a door. You've given the other person a framework to work with, and now they can start analyzing it. They can start poking at your reasoning. They can start identifying gaps in your logic. They can push back on specific parts of your explanation. And suddenly, a decision that was already made is back up for discussion because you handed them the tools to question it. More than that, over-explaining signals something. It signals that you're not fully settled in your decision. It signals that you're seeking buy-in. And people pick up on that. Not always consciously, but they do. People who carry quiet influence, people who get taken seriously without having to demand it, they've figured out something important. They figured out that a decision stated clearly and directly carries more weight than the same decision wrapped in a paragraph of justification. They say what needs to be said, clearly, directly, and then they stop. They don't chase agreement. They don't fill the silence with extra words to make sure everyone's comfortable. They let their decisions stand on their own. And that restraint, that ability to say something and just let it sit there, that's a form of quiet confidence that people feel, even if they can't always articulate exactly what it is they're noticing. 3. Reacting without thinking. This one shows up fast, and it tends to do a lot of damage quickly. Here's how it usually goes. Something happens, maybe someone says something that rubs you the wrong way, maybe a situation unfolds that feels unfair, maybe someone challenges you publicly, or undermines you, or dismisses something you said, and you feel that immediate, almost physical urge to respond, to defend yourself, to correct the record, to let them know you're not going to just sit there and take it. That impulse, right there in that moment, is exactly where most people give away their power. Here's why. When you respond automatically, when your reaction is immediate and emotion-driven, you're essentially handing the other person the controls, because they did something and you responded exactly the way they might have expected. You got flustered, or defensive, or angry, or visibly thrown off, and now they know something about you that they didn't know before. They know your buttons. They know how to get a reaction out of you. They know that if they push in a certain direction, you'll move in a predictable way. And once someone has that information, they have something they can use. There's a phrase you've probably heard before, that the most powerful thing in any situation is the ability to choose your response. And that sounds simple, maybe even obvious, but actually living it is a different thing entirely. Because it means sitting with the discomfort of something happening and not immediately doing something about it. It means feeling the urge to react and consciously deciding to wait. It means being in a situation that's emotionally charged and not letting that emotion drive your next move. That gap,
That space between what just happened and what you decide to do next, that's where real control lives. And it's also where other people start to notice something different about how you operate. Because when you don't take the bait, when you don't get rattled, when you respond to a charged situation with measured calm, people notice that. It doesn't feel neutral to them. It actually feels like strength, and it is. This doesn't mean shutting your emotions off. It doesn't mean pretending things don't affect you. You still feel everything. You still notice it all. You just don't let the feeling make the decision for you. Sometimes you take a beat before you respond. Sometimes you acknowledge what happened without giving it more energy than it deserves. Sometimes you don't respond at all, and you let the silence do the work. But the key is that the response, whatever it is yours. It's deliberate. It's not automatic. And that distinction changes everything. 4. Talking too much. Let's talk about something that doesn't get called out enough, and that's the habit of talking too much. Now, when most people hear that, they immediately think of the person who dominates every conversation and never lets anyone else get a word in. And sure, that's one version of the problem, but that's actually not the most common version. The more common version is subtler than that. It's the person who's perfectly normal to have a conversation with, but who over time reveals a little too much, a little too consistently. Maybe they're always the first to share their plans, always talking about what they're working on before it's actually done, always giving updates on things that didn't really need an update. Maybe they vent openly about their frustrations to coworkers, to people they've only known a few months, to whoever happens to be around that day. Maybe they weigh in on every situation they come across, even the ones that had nothing to do with them and didn't require their input. None of that sounds particularly damaging on its own, but here's the thing. Every piece of information you put out there is information that someone else now has access to. Your plans, your doubts, your frustrations, your priorities, your weak spots. Once someone has that information, they can use it to position around you, to predict your moves, to figure out what you want and where you can be pushed. That's not a cynical way of looking at the world. That's just how information actually functions in human relationships and competitive environments. People who carry real influence are selective about what they put out there. And the key word there is selective, because this isn't about becoming cold or distant or refusing to connect with people. It's about understanding that not everything needs to be said. Not every thought that crosses your mind needs to be spoken out loud. Not every frustration needs to be aired in the open. Not every plan needs to be announced before it's ready. These people tend to listen more than they talk. They ask questions, they pay attention, they let other people fill the space, and in doing so, they actually gather a lot more information than the people who are busy putting their own out there. And when they do speak, when they do offer something, it tends to land differently, because it's not constant, because it's deliberate, because people have come to understand that when this person says something, it's worth paying attention to. That's the kind of position you build through restraint, and you can't build it any other way.
Wanting results right now. We're living in a moment where patience feels almost countercultural. Everything is available immediately. Information, entertainment, feedback, validation. It's all right there all the time, with almost no delay. And without realizing it, that starts to shape our expectations for everything else in our lives too. We want to start something and see progress immediately. We want to put in effort and get recognition right away. We want to make a move and see it pay off now. And when that doesn't happen, when things move slower than we expected, we get restless. We start second-guessing. We start adjusting our plans and trying new approaches when the old ones haven't even had a chance to develop yet. But here's the thing about real influence. It doesn't work on that timeline. Real positioning is built over months and years, not days and weeks. It's built through showing up consistently over a long period of time. It's built through making decisions with a long view, decisions that don't necessarily pay off right away, but that compound over time into something significant. When you're constantly focused on immediate results, you end up making short-term decisions that undermine long-term positioning. You make moves before the timing is right. You reveal plans before they're solid enough to withstand scrutiny.
You push situations that would have resolved better with a little more patience. Think about what it actually looks like to be patient in a high-stakes situation. Someone does something that deserves a response, but the timing isn't right yet. The patient person waits. They observe. They gather information. They let the situation develop a little more. And when they do finally respond, it's precise, it's well-timed, it has an impact that a rushed response never would have had. Or someone is building something, a reputation, a skill, a relationship, a position at work, and it's moving slowly. The impatient person jumps ship or pivots or starts over. The patient person stays in it. They keep working. They trust the process, even when the progress is hard to see. And eventually, what they've been building starts to show up in ways that other people notice. Patience isn't passive. It's not sitting around doing nothing. It's active waiting. It's staying engaged and observant while you let things develop at their actual pace instead of forcing them to move at yours. And it is genuinely one of the rarer qualities you can bring to any situation. 6. Trusting people too fast. This one is worth spending some real time on because it tends to produce some of the most painful and lasting setbacks people experience. Trust is one of those things that feels like it should be simple. You either trust someone or you don't. But in practice, it's a lot more layered than that. Here's how this usually goes wrong. You meet someone. They make a good first impression. They seem warm, genuine, competent, like someone who's on your side. And because of that strong opening, you start opening up to them relatively quickly. You share your thinking. You let them into your plans. You give them access to parts of yourself, your goals, your concerns, your vulnerabilities that you'd normally guard more carefully. And sometimes that works out fine. But sometimes you eventually discover that the person you trusted isn't exactly who they presented themselves as in the beginning. And by then, they already have access to things you can't take back. The problem isn't that you tried to trust someone. The problem is the timeline. First impressions tell you one thing about a person. Patterns over time tell you who they actually are. And those two things are often not the same. The way someone treats you in the first few weeks of knowing them, when they're still in the impression-making phase, is not the same as how they'll treat you 6 months in, when the novelty is worn off and you've been through some actual situations together. People reveal themselves through their behavior over time, through how they handle situations where their interests and yours are in conflict, through how they treat you when there's nothing to gain from treating you well, through whether their behavior is consistent whether or not you're watching. That's the information that actually tells you something real about a person. People with genuine influence understand this. They're not suspicious of everyone. They don't walk around assuming the worst, but they also don't hand out full access to themselves based on a good first impression. They observe. They pay attention to patterns. They note whether what someone says lines up with what they do over time. And then, gradually, based on evidence rather than feeling, they extend more trust. That's not cynical. That's just careful. And it protects you from some genuinely costly mistakes. 7. Being publicly vulnerable in the wrong places. There's a lot of cultural messaging right now, and it's pretty pervasive, that says openness is always a virtue, that sharing your struggles, your doubts, your failures, your internal battles makes you more relatable, more authentic, more human. And honestly, in the right setting, with the right people, that's true. There's genuine value in being able to be honest about where you're struggling. There's real strength in being open with people you actually trust. But that's a very specific set of conditions, and the messaging often leaves out the second half, which is that not every space meets those conditions. Not every audience has your best interest at heart, and not every setting is safe for that level of openness. Here's what happens when you're publicly vulnerable in the wrong places. You lose control of your own narrative, because once you've shared something, once it's out there, you don't get to decide how it gets interpreted or discussed or used. Someone who means well might repeat it in a context you didn't intend. Someone who doesn't mean well might file it away and pull it out at a moment that's convenient for them and damaging for you. And here's the part that most people don't think about until it's already happened. Once something is out, you cannot take it back. The conversation is done. The information exists in other people's heads now, and you have zero control over what happens to it from that point forward. People with genuine influence are still completely human. They struggle, they have doubts, they go through periods of uncertainty just like everyone else. This isn't about pretending to be invulnerable or projecting some artificial image of having everything together. It's about being thoughtful and intentional about where that vulnerability lives. They keep certain things within trusted private circles, people who have proven over time that they can be trusted with that kind of information, and everything else they keep close. Not because they're hiding something, not because they're trying to seem perfect, but because they understand a simple and important truth. Information once shared belongs to the world, and some information is worth protecting. 8. Fighting every battle. Let's talk about something that looks like a lot of strength, but is actually one of the more reliable ways to drain yourself, and that's the compulsion to respond to every single thing that comes your way. There are people who feel like they have to address every disagreement, every slight, every moment where someone says something inaccurate about them, or challenges their position, or undermines them in some way. They feel like staying quiet means losing, like letting something go means you're weak, like the only acceptable response to a challenge is to meet it head-on. And on the surface, that can look like confidence. It can look like someone who stands up for themselves, who doesn't take anything lying down, who isn't a pushover. But watch what actually happens to people who operate that way over time. They're exhausted because they're spending energy constantly on arguments that didn't matter, on situations that resolved themselves, on battles that had nothing to do with where they were actually trying to go. And more than the energy cost, they're distracted. Every minor conflict is pulling their attention away from the things that actually have long-term significance. Every minor battle they choose to fight is taking focus away from the bigger moves they should be making. Here's the reframe that actually matters. Not every situation deserves your energy. That's not a passive statement, it's a strategic one, because your attention and your energy are genuinely limited resources, and how you allocate them matters more than most people realize. Some things, if you just leave them alone, resolve on their own. Some disagreements, if you don't add fuel to them, just fade. Some provocations, if you don't take the bait, end up making the other person look foolish without you having to do anything at all. And then there are the situations that genuinely matter, the ones with real stakes, the ones where your involvement actually changes the outcome, the ones that connect to something you're building long-term. Those situations deserve your full energy and attention, and the only way to have enough of both to bring to those moments is to not spend them on everything else. People who carry quiet influence make this distinction naturally. They don't fight for the sake of it. They don't need to prove something by responding to every challenge. They choose their spots deliberately. And when they do step in, when they do decide a situation is worth their energy, it means something, because it's not constant.
9. Waiting for someone else to point you in a direction. Here's one that shows up in a lot of different forms, and it can be a hard one to see in yourself. There's nothing wrong with learning from other people. Seeking guidance, finding mentors, getting input from people who know more than you about something. That's all genuinely valuable. The people who grow the fastest are almost always people who are willing to learn from others. But there's a real difference between learning from someone and depending on them, and that line matters. When you're in the habit of waiting for someone to tell you what to do, waiting for permission, waiting for direction, waiting for someone else to clarify what the next move should be, you've quietly handed over control of your own trajectory. And most people who do this don't even fully realize they're doing it. It shows up as constantly seeking reassurance before moving forward on something. It shows up as sitting on a decision for weeks because you're waiting for someone else's input before you feel comfortable making it. It shows up as defaulting to what someone else thinks you should do, a boss, a mentor, a partner, a parent, even in situations that are fundamentally yours to decide. And here's what that does over time. It keeps you in a kind of permanent holding pattern, because you're always waiting.
There's always someone whose approval you need before you can move. And that means your progress is contingent on other people's availability, perspective, and willingness to guide you, rather than on your own judgment and initiative. Quiet influence is rooted in internal clarity. It's the ability to look at a situation, even an ambiguous one, even one where you don't have all the information you'd like, and make a call, your call, based on your own assessment. That's not recklessness. You still gather information. You still consult people when it makes sense. But at the end of the day, the decision is yours, and you're willing to own it. And here's what happens when you start operating that way consistently. You build real confidence. Not the kind of confidence that comes from people telling you you're doing well, but the deeper kind that comes from making decisions, living with the outcomes, learning from what happens, and making better decisions next time. That kind of confidence is self-generating. It compounds, and nobody can take it from you. 10. Being afraid to stand alone. This is the last one, and in a lot of ways, it's the one that ties everything else together. Because a lot of the habits we've already talked about are driven at their root by this, the fear of standing alone. Here's what this looks like in real life. People stay in relationships, personal, professional, social, that they've clearly outgrown. Not because those relationships are serving them, not because being in them is making them better or moving them forward, but because leaving would create distance, and distance feels uncomfortable. Distance feels like loss. Distance feels like being alone. People stay in conversations that have nowhere to go, conversations that are draining them, that aren't adding anything, that are just filling time, because stepping out of them feels antisocial or cold or like they're rejecting someone. People stay in environments, workplaces, social circles, situations that are actively keeping them small, that aren't challenging them, that aren't pushing them toward anything. But they stay because the alternative is to step into unfamiliar territory without the comfort of the familiar people around them. And so they stay, and they stay, and they stay. And what this does is quietly, gradually, over time, it limits them. Because the people around you shape your thinking. The environments you spend time in shape your expectations. If you're consistently surrounded by people and situations that aren't growing, it becomes very hard to grow yourself. The space that comes from standing alone, from stepping back from what's comfortable but not actually serving you, is not a punishment. It's a resource. It gives you room to think clearly without being pulled in all directions. It gives you perspective that you genuinely cannot get when you're too close to a situation. It gives you the ability to observe how things actually work without being tangled up in them. People who carry genuine, durable influence are comfortable standing alone when the situation calls for it. Not isolated, that's not the goal. Not disconnected from people, connection matters. But independent, self-sustaining, not needing constant reassurance or company to feel settled and secure. Able to walk into an unfamiliar situation or a quiet room and be okay. And that independence, that rootedness in yourself, is what ultimately allows you to move freely. Because you're not making decisions based on who might leave if you do. You're not staying in places out of fear of what's outside them. You're moving based on what's actually right for where you're trying to go. That's freedom. And that freedom is exactly what makes real influence possible. All right, so let's pull back and look at all 10 of these together for a second. The need to be liked. Over-explaining yourself, reacting without thinking, talking too much, wanting results right now, trusting too fast, being publicly vulnerable in the wrong places, fighting every battle, waiting for someone else to tell you what to do, and being afraid to stand alone. If you look at what connects all of them, there's a pattern that's pretty hard to miss. None of them are loud problems. None of them are dramatic. There's no single moment where any one of them blows your life up in an obvious way. They're quiet. They're subtle. They show up in small moments, in everyday decisions, in the spaces between the big things. And that's exactly what makes them so hard to catch and so costly over time. Here's the other thing they all have in common. Every single one of them is about something being subtracted, something being let go of, something being quietly removed from the way you operate. Most of us spend a lot of time thinking about what we can add, more skills, more knowledge, more connections, more visibility. And those things genuinely matter. But real, lasting influence, the kind that doesn't require you to be the loudest person in the room, the kind that evaporates the moment you stop performing it, that kind of influence is built just as much through what you remove as through what you add. It's built by removing what makes you reactive, so that your responses are always deliberate rather than automatic. It's built by removing what makes you predictable, so that people can't easily maneuver around you. It's built by removing what makes you easy to influence, so that your direction is yours, coming from internal clarity rather than from whoever happens to be pushing on you at any given moment. Now, none of this happens overnight. That's worth saying clearly. This isn't a weekend project. You don't watch a video and come out the other side having already made all these changes. What it actually looks like is slower than that and more ordinary than that. It looks like noticing something in yourself that you didn't used to notice. It looks like catching yourself about to over-explain and choosing instead to just let the statement stand. It looks like feeling the urge to react and deciding this time to wait. It looks like small choices made in ordinary moments that slowly start to add up to something different. You don't need to fix everything at once. You don't need to show up tomorrow as a completely different person. Just start paying attention. Pay attention to what you say, and whether you're saying it because it needs to be said or because you're looking for something in return. Pay attention to what triggers a reaction in you, and whether that reaction is actually yours or whether someone else has their hand on the lever. Pay attention to what you're tolerating, situations, dynamics, patterns of behavior that you already know aren't serving you. And then, quietly, without making a production of it, start removing what's working against you. No announcement, no performance, just steady, clear-headed movement forward, one small adjustment at a time. That's how this actually gets built.
Before you go, just a quick word. If this kind of content is something you find useful, the straightforward, no-fluff conversations about how power, influence, and human behavior actually work in real life, then sticking around is probably worth your time. This channel is built around one idea, that most of the important stuff, the things that actually change how you move through the world and how people experience you, doesn't come from hype or motivation. It comes from understanding, from slowing down and looking honestly at how things actually work. That's what we do here, consistently. No gimmicks, no big promises. Just grounded, practical content that you can actually apply to real situations. So if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, hit subscribe. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it just means that the next time we put something out, you'll actually see it instead of having to stumble across it by chance. And if you've got something specific you want us to dig into, a topic, a situation, a dynamic you've been trying to figure out, drop it in the comments. We read them, and a lot of the content on this channel comes directly from what people bring up down there. Either way, thanks for watching the whole thing. That means something. We'll see you in the next one.